Welcome. I'm so glad you're here tonight for this webinar. Tonight we're going to talk about how to scaffold student learning, specifically in our geography units. So let me go ahead and pull up our agenda. We're going to talk about why we want to scaffold learning. We're going to talk about how to break down those geography standards, how to illustrate that flow of learning, and then of course you're going to get some downloads as always, and then I'll leave you with some contact info. So before we start, I want to do a brief introduction so we can get to know each other. I was in the classroom for 5 years in middle school, and then I was an instructional technology coach for 2 years, and I worked with pre-K through 12th grade teachers. While I was doing that, I was also an instructional coach for new teachers for a year. And then I was media specialist for a couple of years, but I have been making social studies resources for 5 years. I cannot believe it's been that long already. And on a personal level, I am a new mom of a NICU baby. He is 6 months old as of a couple days ago, and that's also gone by so fast. Yeah, so in the comments, let me know which grade levels you teach so I can get to know you a little bit better. So in the comment section, go ahead and type which grade level you are teaching. Okay, so what you are getting, you're going to get a template to break down standards and determine mastery levels. And we're going to talk more about what all of this means and how to use this a little bit later in the presentation, but just so you know, you're going to get the template, and then you're also going to get some that are already broken down. But you are only going to get this if you are registered. So I have that link at the top of the screen, and I'll also have the link pinned in the comment section. So if you're not registered, then you're not going to be able to get this. So I'll send an email out to everybody who's registered at the end of the webinar, and then you'll get those. So first, we're going to talk about why we need to scaffold learning, or why should we scaffold learning, specifically for geography. So geography is one of those tricky things, especially for middle school, because I think on the surface it seems pretty straightforward. You just have students memorize locations on a map, and that's a common misconception, especially if you're not a social studies teacher. A lot of teachers who don't teach social studies might say, oh, well, you're just having them memorize places on a map. That should be easy, right? No, we have to extend that learning much further than simply memorization. Most of our middle school standards require students to interpret information from data drawn from maps, or it's asking our students to draw conclusions from maps. And this requires students to move past recall because they're having to analyze and interpret, which is a higher depth of knowledge, right? So we have to extend that level of understanding from recall to analysis. So I'm going to give you some how-to strategies and some samples of what that will look like. So here is our how-to. So the first things first is we're going to have to break down the standard. You, as a teacher, are going to have to know, where are the students going? We need to figure out their learning targets. To do that, we have to break down the standards. So once you're able to break down the standards and know the expectations of those standards, where are we going, then you can determine the mastery levels. So the mastery levels is really where you're going to see the scaffolding process. So many state standardized tests break students up into categories. Our state, Georgia, uses beginning, developing, proficient, and distinguished. So what we are going to do is categorize what that looks like with our geography standards. So we want to break down the standard, and then to take it a step further, we want to determine what those different mastery levels will look like. So if the student is in a beginning category, what is that student able to do? Versus if the student is in a proficient or distinguished category, what is that student able to do that this beginning level student isn't able to do? So once we break down the standards, we're going to determine those mastery levels of what that looks like. So to help us determine those mastery levels, you can Google the 8th grade Georgia achievement level descriptors, and find what those look like. They have them for 5th grade and for 8th grade, not for 6th or 7th because we're not tested there, but we can use those as samples. So once we have that figured out, that's going to give us the flow of learning. Because if you know what the beginning level student should be able to do and what the distinguished level student should be able to do, you automatically have a flow of learning that we have to start here and build and build and build to be able to do this. And then I'm going to tell you how you can use this in your classroom. This is great for differentiation, for honestly your original teaching flow, and differentiation and reteaching, that sort of thing. So we're going to go into depth there. So our first strategy, as we talked about, is to break down the standard. You might have already done this. So a lot of teachers during professional development, for example, will have a PLC or a professional learning day where they have already broken down the standards, especially if you're on the learning target train. So a lot of schools are jumping on using learning targets. In my school, we started that, I want to say my first year teaching in 2013, they started the push towards learning targets. And when we did that, we had to break down the standards. So this probably is not an unfamiliar process. However, if you are a new teacher, let me explain it for you. So it's not as complicated as it might seem, but it is a little bit tedious, especially because social studies has so many standards. You guys have so many standards. So that's what makes this process hard, is just because there's so many of them. So when you're breaking down the standards, you've got to think about how many skills are there, what are the expectations, and what are the DOK levels within that standard. So this is hugely important that we break down these standards, because we have to make sure that our teaching has the same expectations, the same skills, and the same depth of knowledge as our activities. They all have to have the same skills, the same expectations, the same depth of knowledge, and our assessments have to have the same depth of knowledge to really cover and master those standards. So you really have to have these standards broken down by the expectation and by the DOK level to make sure that your teaching matches. Then you also have to make sure, if you're creating your own assessments, I know some districts provide assessments that are pre-made. Some, like my school districts, we created our own assessments, or we had a team of teachers that created them. So either way, you have to make sure that what you're teaching is going to match the rigor of those assessments, which have to match the rigor of the standard. So when I talk about DOK level, I'm talking about rigor here. So depth of knowledge, there's a wheel, the depth of knowledge wheel, but it's really talking about the rigor. So we want the rigor of our teaching to match the rigor of the standards and to match the rigor of the assessments. So that is going to be a huge value if you can have those standards broken down. So the first thing that I want to point out when you're breaking down the standards, and it might seem a little obvious, and honestly it's going to make your lives as social studies teachers a little bit more complicated, because there's a whole lot of these conjunctions in here in your standards. So for the first standard that we're going to look at, SS7G2A, explain how water pollution and equal access to water impacts irrigation, trade, industry, and drinking water. So this is really two separate pieces of information. Students have to explain how water pollution impacts irrigation, trade, industry, and drinking water. But then they also have to explain how unequal access to water impacts irrigation, trade, and drinking water. Those water pollution and unequal access are completely different. So when you're thinking about unequal access here, this is because of the rivers and some land conflicts here. So there are, only a few rivers there in the Middle East, and there's some countries that are upstream that are damming it and preventing some of the countries further down from getting equal access to water. So that's completely different from the water pollution. Yes, some of the water pollution comes from those upstream that are polluting those downstream. That's certainly the case, but they really are two different things that students are going to have to explain. So we don't necessarily want to loop them together, because you could have a student who understands how water pollution will impact trade, industry, and drinking water, but may not have mastered the unequal access part. So we want to give them credit for mastering part of the standard and then help them, support them with the other part. So anytime you see the word "and," you're going to have typically two different standards. Now this one says how it can impact irrigation, trade, industry, and drinking water. Because that's such a long list, I probably wouldn't break that up. You could break that up, because technically a student could understand how, could master the part where water pollution affects drinking water but not affecting irrigation, because they're not really sure what irrigation is. Certainly that could be the case. If you want to take it that far and break that up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 8 different learning targets, that's totally up to you. I probably would just separate this one into 2, but again, whatever works for your kids. And I also want to point out the rigor is going to depend on the verb of your standard. So here we have explain how water pollution. So sometimes in our geography standards we have identify, we have locate, or we have explain. Those are typically the ones that we see in our geography standards. So the rigor of locate and identify is much lower than the rigor of explain. So those are things you have to be aware of with your DOK level. To do your standard breakdown, I recommend getting with your social studies team to work on this together if you don't already have it. So a lot of schools will already have the standard breakdown. Even if you had them from the 15-16 standards, you could probably pull from that information and just update it to match the changes from the standards. But I recommend, if you haven't gotten your standards broken down yet, I recommend using your social studies team, if you have one, to sort of divide and conquer. And when you're breaking that down, you want to separate them into different learning targets, but also make sure, and I didn't show this in that example, but make sure you are identifying the rigor. We use the DOK level at my school system, so if that's easiest, then use whatever rigor scale you want to look at, or if you're going to create your own, it doesn't matter. You just need to have a rigor scale that's identifying each standard and each learning target in your standard breakdown. So use your team to help you with this. This is a lot of work to do all by yourself. And if you don't have a team, join my Facebook group, and you could probably partner up with someone, or someone might be able to share the standard breakdowns that they've already created. So you can join the Facebook group and just ask in there if somebody wants to work with you or have one to share. Once you have broken down the standard, our second step is to determine our mastery levels. So this is where we are categorizing those skills as beginning, developing, proficient, or distinguished. This is going to be case by case, and it is not one size fits all. So this is where your achievement level descriptors and your depth of knowledge wheel will come in handy. So if you can access, like if you are doing this process, I'm going to give you some samples to get you started, but if you are doing this process on other standards, or if you're working, I'm giving you some geography, so if you want to do this process for economics or for history or, other sections, then I recommend getting that achievement level descriptors from 8th grade and from 5th grade. And you might even, if you just Google search Georgia Achievement Level Descriptors Social Studies 2015-2016, you might be able to find 6th and 7th grade from the old standards. These achievement level descriptors and your depth of knowledge wheel is going to come in handy when you are creating this chart here. So let's look at the example. It says locate the actual standard SF6 G1B 6th grade geography is locate on a world and regional political physical map the countries of all of those. Remember, we are breaking these down beginning, developing, proficient, and distinguished. So we want to categorize what the student should be able to do in each level of learning. This is our scaffold process. This is our scaffold. This is our flow of learning here. The student who is a beginning learner for this particular standard should be able to, let me move my face, should be able to locate Latin America on a world map. So a beginning level student probably will not be able to locate Chile on a world map, but they will be able to locate Latin America. So beginning student for this standard should be able to locate Latin America on a world map. The developing student should be able to distinguish Latin America among other regions in terms of geography and climate. Students who are proficient will be able to locate all of those standards. So the proficient typically is going to be the standard. So distinguished, remember, is above the standard. Proficient is the standard. So that one, proficient, when you're creating your chart, proficient is pretty much a given. It's a freebie because that should be the standard. Now distinguished, we're going to extend this learning past the standard into one that we might need later, hint, hint. Students will distinguish Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and Panama from other nations by location, climate, and distribution of natural resources. That is a standard that's going to come up later. So if we have students that are distinguished that we need to extend their learning, we can use this. We can start introducing climate, distribution of natural resources, and how that's different from other countries. Our third step in scaffold student learning for geography is to illustrate the flow of learning. So basically, you are just taking that chart and thinking about it as a flow of learning or a flow of teaching. So for our example, students are not required to know climate and distribution of natural resources for this particular standard. They are not required to know that. So we're going to have that in the distinguished category. Again, when you are creating these charts, I highly recommend getting with your social studies team and knocking this out together. You could work together, like you could plan for a couple hours of a work session and knock this out all together, or you could divide and conquer. So, you take these couple of standards, the next person takes this unit, split them up and then put them together in all one big document. Either way, this is a ton of work for you to do by yourself. So I'm giving you some to get you started. But if you want a team, so if you don't have a social studies team and you want someone to work on this with you, reach out, let me know. And if there's enough of us that we can grab together, then we can do a Zoom call or something and we can knock this out together. So if that's something you're interested in, reach out and let me know. So to summarize, when you're illustrating the flow of learning, that's basically taking this chart and thinking of it as a flow of learning. So students will first locate Latin America on a world map. Second, they'll distinguish Latin America from other regions in terms of geography and climate. Third, they'll be able to locate those specific countries. And fourth, this is optional if you can get there, then they'll be able to distinguish those countries from others by location, climate, and distribution of natural resources. Sorry, I keep moving my face. I didn't plan the slides to leave room, so I keep covering stuff up with my face. So I'm sorry I'm jumping around. So last but not least in our process is we are going to implement these tiers or this scaffold process. We can implement it in terms of your original lesson. So the very first time you're teaching it, you're starting with that beginning, you're starting with locating Latin America on a world map. And then the next day, we're going to talk about how that is different in terms of geography and climate from other regions. And then you're going to practice locating those specific countries. And then you're going to do the distribution of natural resources and climate and how those are different. So your first time teaching probably should go on this flow of learning because it matches the logical flow of the thought process. You can also use this when you are reteaching. So you might find when you are breaking your standards up in this way and you're breaking your standards into separate learning targets, you might find that your students need less reteaching than you originally thought because likely they understand part of things or sections of things. They may not understand the whole thing, but they probably have part of it. So you can use this. So if you're giving an assessment, even if it's a formative assessment, an exit ticket out the door, you can think about questions on that exit ticket, create that exit ticket to have questions that are strategic. You can do this for a warm-up too. Think about questions that are going to allow you to categorize your students as beginning, developing, proficient, or distinguished. So put one question from each of those categories as part of your formative assessment, and then the next day you know kind of which stage they are in their flow of learning, and then you might be able to quickly bring them up because you can identify them fast. So you can use this for identifying them in order to reteach. So if you find that most of your students fall into one category, then you just need to regroup and reteach that tomorrow. If you find that they're kind of scattered all over the place, then break up your classroom in, use 15 minutes to have different stations or something where you are reteaching them specifically what they are needing, and it'll probably take less time because you're hitting those skills very specifically. You can also use this for self-assessment. I am a huge fan of self-assessments. I use self-assessments in my 7th grade classroom, and y'all, I'm telling you, it was a game changer, because when you say, study for your quiz, we've got a quiz on Friday, whatever, okay, you can use this, your bell ringer is to study 10 minutes for your test, and these 7th graders are like, no, I'm good, I know it all, I don't need to study, I studied last night, I don't need to study. Okay, well then they make a failing grade on the assessment, and they are surprised, they are shocked that they made that low of a grade. So I found that with my 7th graders, that they really thought that they knew it. So at first, I'm thinking, okay, they're middle schoolers, they're just real confident. They know they don't know this. They know that they didn't study for it. They know that they're not studying for it now. They know they don't know this. But they don't. They really thought that they knew what was going to be on the test because they could read the vocabulary that we had in our notebook. So student self-assessments to me are huge in letting your students know what they need to study, because typically 7th graders don't have great study skills, right? We have to teach them how to study. So the first step in teaching them how to study is teaching them what they need to study. So if you have a big unit test, it's not realistic to ask them to study, all 30 pages of your notebook, or from this chapter in the textbook, if you still use those. So it's more realistic for them to identify exactly what they need. So my point here is to bring this back. Sorry, I went on a tangent there. I love self-assessments. But if you create your self-assessment strategically, then you and your students will be able to categorize themselves into those different beginning, developing, proficient, and distinguished. They will be able to do that themselves based on the self-assessment's results. And by self-assessment, I do not mean to color which emoji face you think you are. The assessments have to have actual questions that they are answering without using notes. And that is your true eye-opener. It is not going to be them reading the standard and them checking, yes, I know it, no, I don't know it. They have to prove that they know it or they don't know it. So that is a huge eye-opener for them. And honestly, it really changes their perception on what they actually know and what they have no clue. Let me correct what I said before. I don't think that they just don't have a clue, that they don't know about it. I think what trips them up for middle school students is that when they're studying or they're looking through their notes, they're looking at definitions of things. So yes, they can recall, they can define, but can they analyze? So when you're creating your self-assessment, make sure that your self-assessment has some of those questions that are high rigor so that the student can understand that I need to know more than just the definition of something, or I need to know more than to be able to just locate Chile on the map. Okay, I can find Chile, no big deal. but can you analyze, like, how is this different? Or even something as simple as, okay, well, is Chile north or south of the equator? You know, they need to know that it's more than just recall. And I think sometimes they get confused because they think since they can identify or locate or define that they know the standard, they don't have to study. So that's my correction for the self-assessment. Okay, that was really long-winded and I'm sorry. Differentiation, of course, you can use, if you've got those students identified into those different categories of your standard, you can use that for differentiation. So you can use it for grouping. You could use it to group like students together. You could take one kid from each category and put them together in a group. So however you want to find your differentiation, this scaffolding the learning and then using that to categorize your students is going to help aid you in your differentiation efforts because you're going to be much more specific to their needs. Okay, so what you are going to get a template to break down your standards and to determine the mastery levels. And then you're also going to get sample standard breakdowns for 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade geography standards. So I don't have every geography standard on there, but I'm going to show you what I do have. So let me pull that up really fast. Hold on just a second. Here's your template for breaking down your standard and determining the mastery levels. So I have analyzed the standard, so you'll write or type your standard here. And then down here at the bottom, this is when you're going to scaffold that and break that up. And I have a sample here. Now, if you want this in a digital form, because there are so many standards, I probably wouldn't want to handwrite this. But if you want to put this in a digital form, you could save this page as an image or take a screenshot of it and then upload it to Google Slides. Adjust your slide size to 11 by 8.5, which will make it this landscape. And then you can put it as the background and just add your text boxes over it and then share it with your team. And then you guys can just duplicate those slides and knock this out. And then you have a sample here that I've done for you. The samples, so I've got a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. These are geography standards again. So I want to point out the environmental issues standard. So SS6G2B explained the environmental issue of destruction of the rainforest in Brazil. So our beginning learners are going to define deforestation, define lumber, and identify the benefits of the rainforest. Those are all our beginning learner steps. And then when they're developing, they're going to identify the causes of deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. And we can't stop there. So the standard says, explain the environmental issue of destruction. So we can't just list the causes. So to be proficient, we have to explain the effects because we're talking about the issues of destruction of the rainforest in Brazil. So to be proficient, they're going to have to explain the effects. And then to be distinguished, we're going to analyze the impact of continuous loss of the rainforest. So not only what we're dealing with now, but if this loss continues, what will be the impact? We're going to analyze the relationship between the expanding population and deforestation. So that's still kind of cause and effect, but we're going to go specifically to analyze that relationship. And then we're going to describe efforts to reduce deforestation in the rainforest. So how are people or how are governments helping to reduce this problem? How are they hoping to solve the problem? So to be distinguished, we're going to go through all of those. And, you know, this scaffold the learning to figure out what would be distinguished is also going to help you figure out what your need to knows and your it'd be nice to know if we had time standards or topics. So if you are running out of time in your unit, you might not get to the distinguished. So if you know ahead of time, if you have broken this down, if you know that your assessment's coming up and you're planning for next week and you're running out of time and you're stressed, if you pull out your flow of learning, this standard breakdown, this mastery level, then you might realize that, okay, well, I've got 3 days talking about efforts that people are using to reduce the deforestation in the rainforest. You don't have time, and that's not part of the standard. So we're just going to cut to proficient. So we might keep the analyze the relationship and expanding population because that is closer to that standard. But if you don't have time, this is going to give you a good chart to look at to, okay, we're going to cut this and do it later if we have time. Or this could be a fast finisher activity after the assessment or something like that. So I don't want you to say like, don't do it at all ever. But if you are short on time and you really have to trim the fat, this is going to help you determine your need to knows and it'd be really nice to knows or we'll get to it later things. So this tool can be helpful in a variety of different ways. Well, that is all I have for you tonight, and I'm so glad that you made it to the end of the webinar. If you made it to the end, thank you very much. Remember to email me if you want to collaborate to break down your standards or to create those mastery level charts. If we have enough people that would like to participate in this, then we can put something together and knock that stuff out. Also, email me if you have general feedback or if there's anything else in general that you need. Make sure that you are registered. So I've got the link pinned in the comments down below, or you could go to sarahmillertech.com/webinar to get all of those materials. So I've got an email scheduled to go out at 8 tonight with those templates for you. So make sure you're registered before 8 o'clock to make sure that you can get that when it comes out. I'll send another email out in the morning just in case you are watching a replay. Also, I wanted to make sure you knew about our social studies membership. If you don't know already, we've got a membership that is just for our middle school social studies teachers. And this membership allows you to have credits towards 4 resources of your choice that are in the Sarah Miller Tech store. So you can shop or browse the store without being a member. So if you're not sure if this is right for you, you can go to socialstudiesmembership.com and at the top menu, click on shop, and you can browse the store there to see if we have things that you will need. So you can explore that without being a member, but if you are a member, you'll get 4 credits every month that you can use towards purchases. And I also release brand new resources every single month for members. We have webinars, we've got a private Facebook community, so there's lots of perks to being a member. You can also follow me on Instagram, Sarah Miller Tech, and I've got a lot of content there. You can also join my email list. If you go to sarahmillertech.com, there is a place you can do that there, or you can find me on Facebook. So that's all for tonight. I'll see you soon.